information will also add to that. So next up on the schedule is Firdose Moonda, coming to us also from South Africa. Yoga, Gender, and Race in Contemporary South Africa is the title of her presentation. Firdose, welcome to the stage. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to try and share my slideshow with you. And thank you, Ruth, for an amazing presentation with lots of interesting things to chat about. A lot of you may not know me. I'm Firdose Moonda from Cape Town in South Africa. And I have started, paused, restarted, and paused again a doctorate in various subjects around race, gender, and yoga in South Africa, in Africa. And so this is very much kind of in the middle of, I suppose, reshaping what it is that I'm trying to do. And it's a number of things. So I thought I'd just kind of look at where I am thus far, mostly, I guess, a little bit stuck because the history of yoga in South Africa and then more broadly in Africa is really understudied, and there's very little for us to go on. A couple of years ago, I presented on the history of asana yoga in South Africa, and what I had found up to that point was that the documented history of asana yoga dated back to the 1960s, which is really not that long ago. And it comes from when Joyce Stewart and 11 other white women from the Kwa-Zulu Natal province went to train with BKS Iyengar in African countries, including Mauritius and Botswana. And that's because there was a travel ban between South Africa and India from 1954 onwards, when India opposed the apartheid regime and diplomatic contact was ended. It's always bothered me that that is the history of yoga in South Africa, because being an Indian migrant myself, or a grandchild really of Indian migrants, it never sat well with me that the history of yoga in South Africa could trace back to the small group of women, when it surely must come from my grandparents and those of that era. So we know that Indian migration to South Africa began in the 17th century, and large-scale migration we can trace back to 1860, when the SS Truro arrived at the Natal coast, bringing the indentured labor program. That wasn't where I would trace my history back to. I would trace mine to the Gujarati traders who arrived in southern Africa. My grandparents came in the 50s, but there was migration into East Africa from centuries before that. And what I haven't found at all to date is any evidence of yoga by that name traveling with these migrants. I found a few other things which I suppose are synonyms for yoga. And I had a great presentation with a student the other day who was doing her teacher training, who said to me, we didn't call it yoga, we just called it life. And I think that it's in exploring these life stories that we may find a little bit more on the history of yoga in Africa and in South Africa through the Indian migration. Ruth also used a phrase that really struck me, which was an anxiety of authenticity, because I think people like myself, people of Indian heritage and origin, we have the anxiety to prove that something of the culture came with our forefathers and came with our ancestors. And that's definitely where I'm sitting. So that's the question, which I'm grappling with. How much of what we call yoga today would have come to Africa with the Indian diaspora, and how much of it was brought by women like Joyce? And so part one of what I'm trying to do is the history of yoga in Africa, which is obviously huge. And then also really looking for representation in the Indian diasporic community, and particularly among women. So it's really the story of me and people like me, and how much are we represented in yoga? And that really brings to me the question of who am I actually, as somebody who clearly has Indian heritage, and who are people like me, yet we're also African. And I look at this often every year, especially around our Heritage Day, and return to the speech from our former president, Thabo Mbeki, who gave this at the inauguration of the Democratic Constitution. And he spoke about all sorts of Africans, and this was the line that was for us. I come from those who were transported from India and China, whose being resided in the fact solely that they were able to provide physical labor, who taught me that we could be both at home and be foreign, who taught me that human existence itself demanded that freedom was a necessary condition for that human existence. And it really speaks to, I guess, what we were, physical labor on the sugarcane plantations, labor in the trades, in the markets, and everything and nothing all at once. We could be both at home and foreign. And it's something I feel and something I know people of my generation and people of Indian heritage feel often, is that we don't really know where it is that we sit, but we know the role that we played in particularly the South African anti-apartheid struggle, but also the struggle for Indian independence. And it's these kinds of things that we sit with alongside our histories pretty much being erased. So when you look at the history of the Indian diaspora in South Africa, as Ghulam Vahed and Ashwin Desai, who were two of the foremost scholars in this area, write, is that we were largely written out of the nation's official history, especially during the periods of segregation and apartheid. And we were called the Indian problem in terms of where to fit in the social sandwich, not white enough, or not light-skinned enough to be privileged, and not dark-skinned enough to be treated as badly and as poorly as some of our compatriots. And the studies around Indians in South Africa would focus a lot on Gandhi, particularly and the time that he spent here, and a little bit on the political struggle. But we don't really know much about the lifestyles that people in the Indian diaspora built for themselves, unless, of course, you lived it yourself, which is what a lot of us would have done. I also think that the second little quote that I've included speaks to the battles that we've had, because being displaced means that we've had to kind of fight this battle between assimilation into Anglo-centric norms as well as a maintenance of our own culture. And oftentimes you'll hear peers talk about the kind of chameleon generation, where a lot of us would have gone to very good schools, sometimes whites-only schools, as the integration process started, and we would have got there before, as Courtney described, our colored or our Black African compatriots, and we would have changed our accents, we would have felt embarrassed about our own cultures, we would have hidden the rituals and the traditions that we practiced at home because we were trying to assimilate. And now that we we're 30 years almost into our democracy, and a lot of us are adults at the phase of life where we are addressing how it is that we look at our cultures and finding that we're quite distant from it. And so there is this real absence and real kind of blank of who we are. And I think some of yoga and contemporary yoga fills that, because it shows us things that look like us. It shows us the rituals, the chanting, especially those of us who would have heard our grandparents, the temple visits, the gods and goddesses that we worship, the sounds that are familiar to us, the smells that are familiar to us, but we're still trying to find our place in that. And I think it's important for us to understand who are the Indians in the South African diaspora. So we're a very small group of people, 1.67 million, and we identify on a broad category, Indian Asian, which means we also identify with migrants from East Asia. And so that's not a very accurate number, but just 2.73% of the total population in South Africa, a breakdown here of those who identify as Hindu, which is the majority, and then a small minority of Muslim Indian heritage South Africans. What's important to note is that in South Africa, there's been no significant conflict between Hindus and Muslims, as is the case in other parts of Asia, but also that Muslim South Africans don't only come from an Indian heritage background, but there are many Muslim South Africans from the Cape Malay background, something that Courtney described earlier, what we would call the colored communities, and then, of course, Black African communities, particularly from Somalia, migrants from Somalia, who are in South Africa. So we've got this sort of very strange intersection that we sit at, and I sort of sit here as an Indian from a Muslim background, but having grown up where, as segregated community, we were thrust together. So Indians of all backgrounds, Hindus and Muslims, lived cheek to jowl and lived each other's cultures. We lived Eid and we lived Diwali. We lived Kali Puja. And we lived the sacrificial Eid al-Adha. So that's the intersection that we sit at. And it's quite difficult to disentangle what is ours and what is someone else's, as well as what is Indian, what is African, and how we can relate to where we fit into the discourse. I've had a little look around the representation of people of Indian heritage in modern yoga, and particularly women. And this is quite challenging because there isn't a registry for yoga teachers in South Africa, neither is there an overarching umbrella body. There is one resource, which is Yoga South Africa, a volunteer-run website that contains a teacher directory. Of course, it wouldn't contain all the teachers in the country. It would be limited to those who have given their data to be published on the website. And most of these are teachers of modern yoga, so it wouldn't contain those who are running ashrams, for example, especially in the Cape, in the KwaZulu Natal province, and in Gauteng, where we find a lot of ashrams run by members of the Hindu community. So it's really limited, this data sample, but what I found from the 293 teachers listed is that 17 are of Indian heritage, which is a really small percentage, 0.05. 2 identify as male and 15 as female. So the broad understanding that women are the major demographic of yoga practitioners is found here, but there's a very small percentage of them of Indian heritage. And then to get representation among yoga practitioners of people of Indian heritage and women of Indian heritage is very difficult to establish. I've had to rely on a lot of anecdotal evidence of myself and others' experience of attending classes. And what I can definitely conclude is that the representation is minimal. And so it's difficult to find in modern yoga settings, contemporary yoga settings, women of Indian heritage represented. And so I've had to look elsewhere just to see, if we go back to we didn't call it yoga, we just called it life, where else can we see members of the Indian diaspora practicing things that we could recognize as yoga? And one of them is through textual sources and the knowledge that is shared in places like the Ramakrishna Organization, the Shivananda Organization, the Divine Life Society, and a few ashrams scattered around various provinces. And what we found is that these are very much based on access to texts and access to English texts, because most South Africans from the Indian diaspora are first language English speakers. And so they access a lot of their texts that way in communities like the Ramakrishna Center. These are mostly the preoccupation of male practitioners. And so we're not seeing a lot of presence of women in especially the textual study centers. Instead, where we see women represented is in the ritual and healing practices. And these are very small kind of community-based practices. So there's a little bit of research done by some scholars, especially Ghulam Wahid and Ashwin Desai, who I mentioned earlier, that look at how the Indian diaspora connects to its heritage, and especially how it connects to the healing rituals of its heritage. And some of it is concerned with the application of Ayurvedic practices, and some of it to a very small degree with exercise. And what they found is that women, particularly of Indian heritage, will have prayer meetings, and there'll be a lot of chanting in groups that we're seeing. There we go, sorry. And this applies across both Hindu and Muslim cultures. So prayer ceremonies are really one aspect where we can see representation of women of Indian heritage in yoga. And there are some examples of medicinal healing. And I think one of the ones that come up the most is turmeric and ginger milk, which those of us in the more bourgeoisie places of the world will know as a golden latte or something like that. But of course, a lot of us would just drink this at home as, something that you were given, whether you liked it or not. And these are the ways in which we see Indian women engaging with their ancestral culture, particularly through food and through sound, but none of this is referred to as yoga. There's also a lot of crossover in this type of practice with what we see in the Muslim culture of the Malay community, where gathering in community, chanting, prayer ceremonies are also common, as well as the visiting of tombs that we find across the Kramats, so the Sufi Muslims who were oftentimes the descendants of slaves brought by the Dutch from Indonesia. There's a lot of that kind of practice that would look similar to yoga, as well as in the culture of their medicinal healing and their food. And I think Courtney also spoke to that. And that's kind of where the research leads to. I've also then had a look at whether there's any attempts by Indian heritage teachers in Africa to reclaim yoga, which is a narrative that I find quite prominent, especially in the global north, where teachers of Indian heritage, and I've just picked out Susanna Barkataki and some of her Instagram images, where she shares a lot around what yoga is to her, and how the holders and the keepers of the knowledge of yoga are people of Indian heritage, such as herself. But there are very few examples of the same existing in South Africa, particularly. So I've conducted some interviews with South African teachers of Indian heritage, all women, and all who say that they have taught modern, or refer to what they teach as modern yoga. But they make minimal references to tradition. Most of what is being taught is contemporary asana, which is what you would find in commercial studios. And the reclamation narrative and the cultural ownership narrative is largely absent from these discussions. When I've pushed a little bit further in terms of why it's absent, or if there's any kind of dialogue happening with teachers in the global north, particularly female teachers in the global north, where we see a prevalence of this narrative, most of the answers have to do with the reality of having to, or trying to earn a living of commercial asana classes. And the major demographic of South African yoga practitioners in commercial yoga spaces is white and female. And there is significant racial tension still in the country. So not wanting to make people feel uncomfortable, not wanting to raise issues that, will result in people no longer coming to classes is one of the key reasons why South African female Indian heritage teachers are not partaking in this narrative, which has left me, I guess, kind of stuck in when I try to understand whether, how does the Indian diaspora, how is the Indian diaspora represented in yoga in South Africa? And so I've really just got more questions, which have kind of led me to a broader question on embodiment. I've just come back from North Africa, where you certainly see female bodies participating in cultural ritual in much more sure ways and certain ways around the spaces they can occupy, the dancing they can do, the chanting they can do than I have seen of Indian heritage brown women in South Africa. And my next question, I think, which is probably the question of my life, to be honest, is where do people of Indian heritage, apologies for the typo, see their place in society? Because unlike someone like Courtney, who can trace her ancestral legacy back to the land that we are on, people of Indian heritage in South Africa cannot. And at the same time, we cannot trace ourselves or place ourselves back where our grandparents and further back great-grandparents came from, and there's no real connection to that land either. There's deep cultural connection, but the feeling of the body in space and belonging to a particular place is very absent among people of Indian heritage in South Africa. And I know certainly from anecdotal evidence in Uganda, where of course Indians were displaced after the Idi Amin regime. So there is a real lack of sense of place or rootedness. And the next question I'd like to ask is, how much do they view the Indian subcontinent as home or a place to return to? And then is this experience different across different genders? Because we do find that among yoga practitioners and among Indian heritage yoga practitioners, we have a greater number of women than men, which is not different to what we find across any demographic or any racial demographic in South Africa. But what we don't know is whether the experience of embodiment for the Indian man in South Africa would be vastly different to the experience of embodiment for the Indian heritage woman. And yeah, those are my next questions as I look to develop this research, which is turning into, I guess, more of a question around embodiment than it is a question necessarily around yoga, but it's also a question around embodying cultural heritage and understanding whether just being, which is what we often say as people of color in the country, just by being in spaces, just by presenting our physical bodies where they were previously not allowed to be presented, we're already embodying revolution, rebellion, change, and cultural heritage. But is that enough? Or do we need a little bit more? Do we want a little bit more? And how much of what we don't call yoga, but what we do call life, is represented in people of the Indian diaspora in Africa? Thank you.